I want to invite on both Harsha Walia and Nanky Rai for a conversation between each other to kind of start us off in this second part to this teaching. So both it's called sorry, give me 1 second. Okay, sorry. Okay, I was just like looking through my script really fast. So Harsha Walia is a Punjabi Sikh writer and organizer who has been an unpaid organizer in migrant justice, anti-capitalist, feminist, abolitionist, and anti-colonial movements for the past 2 decades, including through grassroots collectives such as No One is Illegal, Defenders of the Land, and Anti-Capitalist Convergence. And Nanky Rai is a migrant settler from Indian-occupied Kashmir who is formally trained in public health and who has been active in multiple anti-colonial and anti-imperial grassroots movements for migrants and health justice for over 15 years. I'll hand it over to both of them to start us off with from the first conversation, and we'll also drop the links to their full bios in the chat as well.
Thank you all. Thank you so much to the organizers for this incredibly beautiful event. For the Ardas, Amanda, for your incredible introduction, Jasleen, for the Gurmat commitment. It's an honor to be in conversation here with everyone, and with Nanky, who is such a fierce and powerful sibling that I'm honored to be alongside. And may I say, perhaps one of the few people who can physically beat me in a physical fight. Let me also just quickly start by saying, before we launch into this conversation, Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh. And I really want to start by stating that as a queer Sikh feminist, I want to express my full and unconditional support for Palestine, for the Palestinian people, for Palestinian land, for Palestinian liberation, for the Palestinian right of return, and for Palestinian resistance in all of its forms. I'm here on Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish lands that have been stolen by the Canadian colonial state. We know that Canada and Israel are shared settler colonial projects. And, you know, to think about being in solidarity with Palestine also necessarily means land back here where I am on the Salish Seas. So land back from the Salish Sea to Palestine. And I'm excited to be in conversation with Nanky, as I said, and Nanky so generously thought up of some questions for us to be in conversation about. So maybe I'll ask you a question, Nanky, but of course, feel free to add anything by way of starting. But if you can please talk about the ways in which your queerness, your Sikhi, being a queer Sikh feminist, being a queer Sikh Kashmiri, all of that and more informs your solidarity with Palestine.
Thanks, Harsha. Yeah, I'd also just like to begin by acknowledging I'm calling in from lands that I think should firmly remain under the jurisdiction of the Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and Mississaugas of Credit First Nations, from Takaranto. And as Harsha said, I think you know, it's an important conversation that we're having. I think it's really beautiful. Again, thank you to all the organizers for inviting us into this conversation. I've been thinking about how I haven't actually participated in a conversation where a lot of my parts of who I am are actually brought into the space to talk about how we exist in the world and how we organize and how we practice solidarity. So deeply appreciative of that. Okay, how does my queerness and my Sikhi and my Kashmiriness and all of it? So, I mean, when I was thinking about this, I immediately did think about collectivity, and I thought about our ability to be able to self-organize. And initially I was like, yeah, that comes from my Sikhi. And then I was like, no, wait a minute, like that actually also comes from my queerness. That actually also comes from my Kashmiriness. So I think I just want to, acknowledge that I don't think we can separate out the many ways our existence in this world inform the values that underpin our solidarity with Palestine. So I think when it comes to our capacity, particularly as Sikh people, to be in collectivity, to be able to self-organize, I think about the practice of seva, meaning service to others. And I think about how seva has really been able to teach me a real felt embodied practice of what sovereignty can be on a day-to-day basis, on what community building can be. on what a liberatory way of being with each other can be, and particularly one that directly counteracts a European model of sovereignty or nation building that's deeply rooted in capitalism and in territoriality and bordering and expropriation and exploitation of land and people and its resources. So I think I've been thinking about that a lot. I think I was joking with you recently about how I was in a line waiting to get the visa. And of course, this is a line that happens at midnight. This is before the e-visa started to India. And from midnight to 8 a.m., people are organizing the job. People are organizing the list on who's going to get in how. People are organizing who's going to stand outside the door and how the kids are going to stay in warm cars. So I think that really made me think about just our capacity to be able to self-organize well. I also think about Deg Tej Fateh, right? I think about victory to the kettle and the sword, or how would we translate that? I think for me, that's like such a framework of solidarity, this idea that represents a commitment to nourishing and preserving life, as symbolized by the kettle or food or, nourishment, and a commitment to being in defense of oppressed people anywhere and everywhere, as symbolized through the sword. So yeah. The relationship of that with my Kashmiriness and my queerness, I often also think about how, an understanding of what collective self-determination and bodily autonomy means, and when it is violently suppressed as queer people, as genderqueer people, as Kashmiris. I think that allows us to deeply understand the importance of actually being ungovernable. So I think one of the core forms of my existence in the world is that, I think when the occupier is trying to control you, either through elimination or annihilation or assimilation, I think our only option is to be ungovernable, to not be controllable, to be defiant, to be the disruptors, to cause disorder in the status quo of these ethno-nationalist regimes. So I think we're seeing that practiced in Gaza. I think we're seeing that practice in the West Bank, globally, wherever the diaspora is, and Palestinian diaspora is, particularly in the practice of Samud, which I feel like I'm reading so much more about in this current moment, especially as a healthcare worker, witnessing other healthcare workers practice it in such a deep, deep way. This idea of a steadfast commitment to liberation of your people, to Palestinian liberation. And I think, it is a real defiance of assimilation. It's a defiance despite the ever increasing chokeholds and enclosures of, the Zionist settler colonial regime that's growing every day. So the short answer, I think, would be really holding on to the practice of both Samud and Seva in this current moment. Yeah. What about you?
Thank you for that beautiful, beautiful answer. And I'm so appreciative and thoughtful about the ways in which you've put Samud and Seva into conversation with each other as principles and practices and ethical ways for us to orient ourselves. So I'm thinking on that. Thank you for that, Nanky. I think for myself, similar to you, and Jasleen, you so eloquently kind of pointed out as well, when I think about our guru's teaching, so many of them, like so much of our siddhant is so clear that, as Sikhs, we are opposed to tyranny, and that our goal is not just opposition of tyranny, but destruction of tyranny. That is what we have been taught. That is what to be practicing as Sikhs means, and that protection of oppressed and marginalized people is one of our principles. So I think about that. I also think that, when I think about Seva, as you pointed out, Nanky, and I think about Sarbat da Bhala, I think those are necessarily expansive ideas. They are calls for us to think about that in relationship to the world, in relationship to all people, all non-human creation, to think about the universe with respect to what it means to be in Seva, and to think about Sarbat da Bhala and how we contribute to that. So for me, Sikhi very much orients my ideas of solidarity. And I think, especially in this moment, I'm so thoughtful about how important it is for Sikhs to be in solidarity with Palestine for so many reasons. I know we'll come back to some of it in terms of, India and Israel and more. But, for so long, Zionists have been trying to make inroads into Sikh activism, and by suggesting that Zionism and ideas of Sikh revolution are somehow synergistic. And I remember being at a few commemorations for 84 over the years where, Zionist speakers have been given platforms and have spoken about how Sikhs can become powerful through identification with the state of Israel. And so I think as Sikhs who are necessarily opposed to colonialism and supremacy, for me, organizing in support and in solidarity with Palestine as a Sikh is so important because it is also so necessary to push back against those who are trying to capitalize on Sikh suffering to further genocide against Palestinians. Or as folks have spoken about in this conversation, when we're told that we can't care about Palestine because we can't be too political, or we have our own struggle, our own sangharsh to carry out. For me, that's not what Sikhi has ever represented. It's not what the Guru's teachings, I believe, tell us. And so, I think for me that it's so necessary to not just identify with Sikhi as kind of an identifier, but to really say that it is those principles that call on me to think about Ekamkar, to think about Sarbat Bhala, to think about Seva in service to the world and in service to all people's struggles. And when you talk about Fateh, I think about that as well. I think one of the things that Sikh principles really helps orient when it comes to the struggle for Palestine is that we deeply understand armed resistance as so central to what justice requires of us often in this world. My family took up arms in Delhi during 84, during the pogroms and genocide. So for me, I think it is from an understanding of Sikh Sangharsh, of Sikh revolution and Sikh principles that I say Fateh to the resistance. And I think also, as you articulated, Nanky, when I think about the Sangat, it is also deeply informed by queer ideas of who belongs, who we claim, and who claims us. And that the idea of who we care about and who we see ourselves connected to is necessarily expansive, that the Guru's Panth is for all of creation, is for all queer and trans family, is for all people who are in struggle. And so for me, as you said, it's not really one or the other, right? It's this idea of us being in deep connection to people in struggle. And maybe the last thing that I'd say is, when I think of being in Chardi Kala, I can only think of being in Chardi Kala through struggle. I can't imagine being in Chardi Kala through any other way other than a commitment to Seva and through struggle. So for me, being in solidarity with Palestine and being in solidarity with liberation struggles everywhere and anywhere, including on this land and elsewhere, is deeply informed by Sikhi, by ideas of queerness and belonging and claiming all of ourselves as kin. I remember, and this may resonate for you, Nanky, and maybe others too, I have over the years been asked, as many of us are in this moment, right? Like, why do you care? We need to focus on Apna struggles. We need to focus on our own Sangharsh. Right now it's Palestine. Over the years it was, like, why do you care so much about Indigenous land defenders? Why are you organizing alongside sex workers? Why are you organizing with drug users? And for me, the responses to that have always been that when I think of Sangat and when I think of the Guru's Panth, those communities in struggle are central to my idea of Sangat and my idea of the Guru's Panth, and they're not separate from, they're not other. And so for me, that also informs my commitment to Palestine in the now. And I know that you have touched on, Nanky, about how central it is for you in thinking through what it means also to be Kashmiri in this moment and always, and especially this heightened moments of escalation and genocide by the Indian state. And so I want to ask you, what are some ways in which we can understand the connections between settler colonial violence and occupation from Kashmir to Palestine to here on Turtle Island? And how can this understanding inform necessarily Sikh solidarity with global struggles, all global struggles against occupation and apartheid, and centrally our solidarities with Kashmir as well?
Thanks, Harsha. Yeah, oh my gosh, I have so many thoughts about Chardi Kala already, and many other places my mind is going, but I appreciate the question. I think I'll just start by saying that the colonization of Turtle Island, the occupation of Palestine, and the occupation of Kashmir are not the same. I think there's a lot of distinctions. I think with that said, I think the reason why it may be worthwhile for us to actually illustrate some of the similarities is because I think it's helpful to understand which oppressive methods are shared and transferred and duplicated across India and Israel and North America, as well as many other sites of settler colonialism in the world. And I think it helps us to find better pressure points and better understanding of how we actually demobilize and ultimately dismantle a lot of these ethno-nationalist colonial regimes. So I'll start with that. And I think it kind of speaks to our conversation of what it means to who is included in the panth, and what does it mean to engage in resistance, and on behalf of whom. I think, like the very common saying, none of us are free until all of us are free, I think that really is deeply true. It's not just a slogan, it is the reality of how the global world order currently operates. So I think I'm going to try to be short because I know we don't have that much time, but I think some of the similarities between the ways that Indigenous nations on Turtle Island, Palestinians and Kashmiris have and continue to experience settler colonial violence, I think, obviously the most pressing right in front of us is attempted genocide right now in Gaza, all the way to forced sterilizations across all these sites of settler colonialism, to, spatiocide as coined by Sarah Hafani, around this idea of, this displacement of Indigenous peoples through the destruction of the homes, through the destruction of roads, institutions, olive groves, apple orchards, an assault not only on infrastructure, but also against culture, memory, history. I think settler colonial regimes share their tactics in extrajudicial killings, arbitrary detention. I know that the 300 predominantly Palestinian children who were hostages that were released, 233 of them had no charges laid, weren't sentenced for anything. And the others were charged with resisting the occupation, something that's a right under, our principles as Sikhs, and something that's a right also under international law. I think about that, and I think about the Armed Forces Special Powers Act in Kashmir that allows for the arbitrary detention, and also related to enforced disappearances within Kashmir, but not just in Kashmir, everywhere that Indian imperialism has its reach. Two, I think state-sponsored and protected vigilantes. I think in the West Bank, I think about that in North America, I think about that in India, targeting Dalits and Sikhs and Indian Muslims and other religious minorities and tribal communities as well. So I think there's a lot to think about there in terms of what does it look like to practice anti-fascism in a real practical way as well. And I think the occupations are also mass disabling event. I think this is an issue of disability justice. I think about the maiming by occupation forces. We're seeing a lot of limb amputations of Palestinian children and people in general in Gaza right now. And I think about the relationship of that to the world's first mass blinding that was led by the Indian occupation forces with the use of lead plated pellets against Kashmiri youth in 2016 in the valley. We think about journalists being targeted and killed, media lockdowns. The recent lockdowns that we've had where full media blockade has happened is so reminiscent of Kashmiri's experiences in multiple times of upheaval and uprisings and rebellions. I think about surveillance technology. I think about Pegasus, a spyware device, program capable of being able to remotely surveil people's smartphones, and how it has been sold by an Israeli private company, the NSO, to so many nation states. I think about 40 nation states, and we know that spyware is used against our comrades here, against movement leaders and journalists and organizers in Kashmir and India and Palestine and so many different places. I think about the relationship between mass surveillance and criminalization. I was just watching the video of Sikh elder and hereditary chief Sauces being released from prison from yesterday morning. And I was thinking about that and his imprisonment for, again, serving time for defending his territories, being a land and water defender, and the relationship of that to the criminalization and incarceration of national leaders in Palestine and in Kashmir, to land defenders, to water defenders, including the children of the stone pelters from the first Intifada in Palestine, to Kashmiri youth who are stone pelters and incarcerated and detained as a result. All of this, of course, occurring under the dehumanization of colonized people through, Euro-Christian superiority, through the creation of subhumans, through seeing people, and particularly indigenous people, as savages, through the deeply Islamophobic labeling of Muslim and Muslim-coded people as terrorists. I think so much terror is inflicted under the manufactured guise of fighting terror. Again, I could go on. I think the point being really is we need to be able to understand the what, the how, the where, the when of how colonial violence is manifesting itself, so we can learn about the players involved. So we can figure out who's enacting it, we can figure out who's bankrolling it and who's complicit in it, from the corporations involved in ecocide in Palestine and Turtle Island and Kashmir, to the corporations involved in the technologies of surveillance and criminalization like Elbit Systems, to nation state formations like the I2U2, right? This like West Asian squad of Israel, India, UAE, and the US. To Western media outlets, businesses like Indigo, and the conglomerates like Reliance Industries that are all playing a role in manufacturing consent for genocide and the occupations. So I will just say, I think it's important to learn about the way the violence is manifest, but it's also, I think, really deeply important to learn about what forms of resistance and particular resistance tactics in Palestine, in Kashmir, in the diaspora are the most targeted and are deeply attempted to be crushed, because I think it gives us insight into not just what we're fighting against, but what we're fighting for, and what we know is really working, and it creates a lot of fear in the eyes and hearts of colonizers and oppressors. So thinking about uplifting all occupied people's right to self-defense, to replanting the olive trees, to replanting the forests in Kashmir, to rebuilding infrastructure that supports collective life, from cleaning to waterways to autonomous healthcare, media outlets, agriculture, educational infrastructure. I think there's a lot to be said in how the sovereign practice of autonomous spaces that are life-giving and healing are so deeply targeted by these other colonial states. I'll stop there for now, because I know we're also going to talk about the bordering aspect of all of this too. So I'll ask you, how do you think bordering practices kind of contribute to our understanding of the mass dispossession that we're seeing right now of Palestinians and have been seeing for the last 75 years? And how does that inform, our Sikh solidarity with the global struggle against occupation?
Thanks, Nanky. And can I just say thank you for that rapid fire, incredible weaving of understanding violences and resistances, even as they are different, how they are constituted through each other. And I'm also thoughtful about, what does it mean as Sikhs to be in solidarity with Kashmiri Sikhs and Kashmir in general? The most militarized zone in the world, occupied by the Indian occupation forces and by the Indian state, by Brahminical Hindutva forces. And so our solidarity also extends not only to Palestine, but also to Kashmir. In terms of borders, so much of how we understand, or how I understand, mass displacement and mass dispossession is through borders. Of course, as Punjabi Sikhs, borders are so central to how I understand the world and my own life and history. Thinking about the Punjab and partition, which, as we know, displaced 15 million people and killed 1 million people over the span of a year. One of the world's bloodiest displacements that we've ever witnessed. My family, as many of us probably on the call, were displaced. My grandfather started working on passenger and cargo trains during that time that transported up to 5,000 refugees a day. And, so I grew up with stories of the torture, the kidnappings, the burnings, the rapes, the massacres. And grew up with stories, but also grew up with silences, if that makes sense. And so, when I think about borders, it's these histories that we all carry with us. And that continue today, right? Like the impacts of course, the partition reverberate, including in Kashmir, including in Punjab today. And so when I think about that in relationship to Palestine, there are two things in particular, given our time constraints, that I think I would highlight. One is that right now, in kind of global international speak, Palestinians are known as the quote most protracted refugee population in the world. And that's UN policy speak. And oftentimes the ways in which we talk about refugees as if though refugees just happen to be, right? Like the UN's like, you just are a protracted refugee population. And of course, that is because of mass displacement and mass dispossession, right? Like people don't just happen to become refugees. And so, of course, the reason that Palestinians are the world's oldest, quote, protracted refugee population is because of the Zionist occupation for 75 plus years. It is because of the ongoing genocide and settler violence that today continues, right? Nakba is a continuing process and a continuing structure. And this mass dispossession is because of Zionist settler colonial violence. So I think those are always important to think about when we think about bordering practices, is like, what are the forces that create mass dispossession and immobility and containment? The other one that I wanted to briefly highlight is, again, in 47, around the time that, the partition was taking place in Punjab, the UN General Assembly also voted to partition Palestine, right? That's the predecessor for the Nakba in 48. So, we know the Nakba was 48, but we know that everything that led to the Nakba had to do with the British mandate, the partition plan of Palestine. And so I think that is so incredibly important in terms of situating how Zionism and the state of Israel are creations of US empire and European empire, rather, and European colonialism, in much of the same ways that we see these reverberate in the subcontinent and in Punjab. And so I think, those are some key ways in which we can think about borders and partitioning as key pillars of what structures settler colonial violence. I think that's incredibly important. I think also when we think about borders and the impact of borders in Punjab, in particular, we can think about the ways in which borders have completely devastated and deliberately so ideas of pluralism. And so when Palestinians talk about river to the sea, when Palestinians invoke one state, that is a call to a deeply beautiful, pluralistic society and community that defies not only Zionism, but defies bordering practices, right? That defies the idea of borders as a method of rule, that divides borders as a method of rule through division, that divides these social constructions of who's supposed to be where and where they belong, right? So I think of river to the sea as a very clear rejection of bordering practices that have been imposed by, for example, the British and the Zionists and all those who, support that supremacy, that Zionist supremacy. And I think, the last thing that I think is critical in terms of thinking through bordering practices in the contemporary moment, and as you highlighted, Nanky, already, so I'll just be brief on this, is, the really critical ways in which bordering practices and dispossession in general are being exacerbated by India and Israel in particular, right? So India is the largest purchaser of Israeli-made arms. Israel and India share counterinsurgency tactics. They share mass surveillance tactics, as you pointed out. Islamophobia is a key pillar of Zionist and Hindutva rhetoric. And so I think it's so important for Sikhs to stand with Muslim siblings here and elsewhere and in Kashmir and across India, as you already pointed out. I think here in the diaspora, we have to be really thinking about, how this new kind of Hinduphobia definition, this nascent idea of Hinduphobia, really draws from the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. So the ways in which there's a synergy, as we know, between Hindutva and Zionist forces that is not only taking place in India and Israel, but also implicates those of us living here in terms of how we want to oppose these forces. And so I think, those are some of the ways in which we see bordering practices, and we also see state violence in general furthering, dispossessive practices at large. And I know we're tight on time, so Nanky, let me jump into our last question right away, because I do want to ask you this as we're thinking about, all the ways in which we're analyzing violence. And you highlighted how important it is to also be talking about resistance. So I did want to ask you if we can close with, what lessons have you learned from your 10 plus, 20 plus, if you want to age yourself, years of Palestine solidarity organizing that you're carrying with you in this moment that you want to share with us?
Yeah, thank you. And for those organizers, maybe give us a time check just so we know, if you could put that in the chat for us, because I know we could keep going for a long time. I think, yeah, I think some of the things that I'm really thinking about, and I think it goes hand in hand in kind of talking about the similarities in Israel, and not just the similarities, but the deep relationships between Hindutva and Zionism, and beyond that, actually, the states of India and Israel, even before the rise of Hindutva as a state funded and organized body within India. There have been deep ties. I think people often think about the relationship between the two nations as being recent because of India being this anti-colonial, non-allied movement, fighter of the oppressed kind of narrative at the time of partition and its creation. But I think we know that there have been deep ties in terms of military trade from the 50s, 60s onwards that were not known. And that it's often been a strategic relationship with Palestine solidarity for the Indian state, rather than a truly deeply felt valued-based one. So we'll start with that. I think it is deeply important for us to be internationalist in our approach in solidarity. I think we need to be able to understand how all of our liberation is tied. I think that our commitment and sense of responsibility has to run as deep and as deep as the Samud and the Seva that we're seeing by stone pelters, that we're seeing by birth workers, by everyday people digging each other out of rubble, carrying each other to the nearest hospitals, to the health workers that have been martyred for defying the IOF orders to leave because they weren't going to leave their people behind. So I think that it is Palestinians are giving the world a gift of what it means to practice deep humanity, and it is up to us to take up that call right now. I think we've all been hearing about and talking about how much this is a test on the world, not a test for Palestinians. I said this recently somewhere else, but I think I repeat it today because I can't stop thinking about it. I can't stop thinking about hands. Like, I can't stop seeing and bearing witness to hands wiping away tears of children that are covered in soot. I keep thinking about hands that were pumping the oxygen in the lungs of those premature babies before they were forced to abandon them at gunpoint with the false promise of protection. I'm thinking about all the hands during the Seva that are rooted in Samud. I'm thinking about us being able to match that level of courage and commitment in this moment, and ongoing, and recognizing that it's not just an end to the genocide. It's not just an end to the siege. It is a call from the river to the sea, a full end to the occupation that we cannot stop until we achieve that. I think for everyone on this call, especially for those of us that are displaced from our homelands, that continue potentially to feel a sense of unbelonging within the diaspora, I hope we can all find refuge in responsibility. I hope that we can strengthen our demands of self-determination and build interdependency across many colonial borders that impact so many of our lives, so that we can essentially turn these colonizing states into irrelevance and crumble their existence truly. So I think really just large thoughts right now. I'm overwhelmed and bearing witness to what we're witnessing, both the genocide and the actual resolve of the Palestinian people, and what that means for us to be able to take on that courage and commitment. I'll ask you the same question back.
Such beautiful large thoughts. Thank you, Nanky.
No problem.
Yeah, I have a few thoughts too, and I don't know how disconnected they may seem, but I'll say that one of the things that I have learned from Palestinian solidarity organizing, and particularly, of course, from Palestinian leadership and Palestinian comrades, is internationalism. As you pointed out, I think of Hassan Kanafani, who, before he was assassinated, said the Palestinian cause is not a cause for Palestinians alone, but a cause for every revolutionary. And I think about that because Palestinians consistently teach us about what it means to be in solidarity, what solidarity demands of us, and what does it mean to not abdicate our responsibilities in the struggle as internationalists, right? That this is not about charity or humanitarianism, but revolutionary solidarity with all oppressed people. I think about Palestinians who say Gaza is a strategy, not a place. So when we think about Gaza as a strategy, not a place, then we start to again see the ways in which internationalism links us all, that these strategies that are being deployed on Gaza now and before is exactly what links, even in different ways, but links freedom for Palestine to freedom for Haiti, to freedom for Punjab, to freedom for Sudan, to freedom for Kashmir, to freedom here on the Salish Seas, to freedom for Congo, to freedom for Kurdistan, for Hawaii, and on and on and on. So I think about how Palestinians teach us that and have taught me that. I started organizing right after the Concordia riots. Look them up for anyone who's unfamiliar. But the Concordia riots happened right after 9/11. And were in response to Netanyahu, a visit of Netanyahu in Montreal at the time. And that, during the course of that organizing, Palestinians and being the Palestine Solidarity Movement very early on taught me about the futility of reform, taught me about the false promises of liberalism, taught about how there is no two sides in a genocide and an occupation, taught that there is no way that while we all have a responsibility to teach, we cannot take on trying to convince people who are invested in power, right? Like that we need to discern who we are trying to bring into the struggle and where we're putting out our energies. Palestinians have taught me about how deeply revolutionary queer and trans and disability justice and feminist organizing is by rejecting pinkwashing. And how in this current moment, how rotten equity, diversity, and inclusion as a concept is, right? How structurally co-optive it is intended to be and how anti-revolutionary it is meant to be. So those are some of the things that I have learned. And one of the things that I'm holding on to, Nanky, you're talking about hands, is one thing that has been resonating with me is something that Jada, who is Salish, has been talking about in some of our organizing is, she says, I know Palestine will exist in the future because we exist now. Palestine will exist in the future because we exist now. Speaking about co-Salish peoples on these lands. And so one of the things that I have learned from Indigenous peoples all over the world that I'm thinking about is how to maintain our ability to not be so despondent, even as the world is grim, because people have survived so many genocides and are still here. And so, like you said, thinking about Sumud not only in a way that is bright and cheery, but really as what it means to be in resistance, and that we cannot allow ourselves, as Mariam Kaba would say, right, hope is a discipline. And thinking about Chardigala, how those are responsibilities to maintain, that if we are committed to struggle in the long haul, then that is what we are called. We're called to bear witness and we're called to commit.
Thank you, Benji.
Thank you. Someone's going to jump in and tell us what we do now.
I think.
Oh, thank you all so much. Y'all were so brilliant and just so much love coming throughout different channels where folks are just so appreciative the way y'all brought together so many of the movements and holding together both the distinctiveness and also the parallels. It just was done so beautifully and so brilliantly. So thank you so much for directing us and really thinking about also expansive ways of being in Sangat as well. And I just kind of think back to Dr. Pravdeep Singh Kehil's definition of Sangat, where they talk about Sangat as those alongside whom we labor towards both spiritual and political liberation. So, and then thinking about how our liberations are interconnected, then there is a need for us to be expansive with building together and moving towards that liberation together. So, and the way that y'all have kind of exemplified that, not just in the talk today, but in the work that y'all have been doing for so long, and has just been so beautiful. So thank you so much for that. My heart is just so full listening to y'all. For the sake of time, if it's okay, I'll just ask one question before we move on. One question that we had that came in was, how does our itihas / history empower us to step into shahadat, step into sacrifice? Too many in the Panth are mired in Maya and unready to sacrifice. So how y'all kind of draw power through our history to step into the sacrifice?
I mean, I will just briefly say Nirvo and Nirver are deeply guiding forces and principles for me. I think for those who aren't familiar, you know, no hate, no fear. I think that is that true essence of who we are. It's a true essence of the sacrifices the gurus have made. It is what we learn about from a young age, and I think it is a deep understanding of who we must be in this world. And I think about on my deathbed, what will I be thinking about? Will I be thinking about that job? Will I be thinking about that grant? Will I be thinking about whatever the hell it is that we're being threatened with? Or will I be thinking about my commitment to Seva and my commitment to the universe and everything that my ancestors have taught me and the legacy that my ancestors leave behind? So that, and also collectivity. I think that's the other piece. I think none of us do this work in isolation. And we know that there isn't safety in isolation. And I think that is really important. I think build your power within whichever spaces you're in with others. You know, think about it in an expansive way of the Panth and organize collectively, because I think that is also where our power lies too. So hopefully that helps. I'm sure Harsha will have something to say about this.
Thank you. I do, and some of it I wonder is like how much of it, you know, for folks whom we're translating for, so much of sacrifice, when we say it in the English language, sounds like a burden. And, you know, when I understand it and the ways in which we speak about it is, you know, those sacrifices are deeply joyous sacrifices. Like, it sounds like an oxymoron, but it's that we make these sacrifices with joy, with a commitment to something else. Whereas, you know, sacrifice in the English language is such a like Westphalian Protestant kind of ethic. And also Maya, it's such a it's capitalism, right? And so when I think of the sacrifices that we make, you know, I really echo what you say, Nanky, that those sacrifices are not sacrifices as much as they are commitments to collectivity. You know, I've lost a few jobs now in the movement, and I don't consider them sacrifices not because I'm some kind of martyr, but because what we get from being able to live our ethics is something that is so much better, right? Like you feel supported by your people, by your community, by movements. And so I think what we gain, again, in a non-capitalist way, what we gain spiritually from being in community by living out our commitments is something that can never be replaced by anything else. And so to me, there's a joy in those sacrifices because it also cultivates us and we also grow from it. And so it's not a sacrifice in that way, and in a martyr way, it's a sacrifice that calls on us to live out our ethics and that we actually feel more fulfilled by.
Yeah, and I think I would use the word pride, which is kind of strange. I'm not like and I don't really identify with pride in any other ways, like, you know, and that includes the way pride is taken up in the world. But I think, I think for me, the way when I think about sacrifice, it automatically translates to pride in my mind, which I think is resonating with what you're saying around joy, as opposed to something being negative. 100%. And I think part of what I think you were talking about this a couple of days, weeks, I can't, time is, what is time right now? But the importance of being in community, also allowing us to be accountable, so that when you are confronted with these decisions of, are you going to make the fearless move? Are you going to practice no fear? Who are the people around you that are holding you accountable for that? And who are also going to be the ones that are caring for you? Because I think those things go hand in hand. Yeah.
Oh, thank you both so much for that like reorientation. It just made me think about earlier when for Jocelyn's presentation, where when she was kind of talking about Balihari Guryapane, like the kind of thing about Balihari and how that often gets translated into sacrifice, but how actually the way in Sikh it's actually kind of talked about is in a very different way than how sacrifice as the term gets taken up. But I'm just in so much awe of you both as well. So thank you for all of your time.
Thank you.
And with that, we will move to the next presentation.